As long as people click on the links from the shirt's listing page, we'll be fine. But you should note that someone might edit the web address directly. This will still work fine if they specify a valid product ID, like 108. That'll bring up the orange shirt. But what happens if they specify an invalid ID, like 4, or remove the get variable altogether? This page looks pretty broken when we don't have a valid shirt ID. We should check that before we try to display the page. If someone visits shirt.php directly, without a valid shirt ID, what should we do? I vote for redirecting them to the main shirts listing page. They're at shirt.php, so they're probably looking for a shirt. If we can't figure out what shirt they want, then let's show them all the shirts. At the top of shirt.php, let's make sure the get variable represents a valid shirt. Let's put some testing code in place to take a look at these two variables. Remember that the exit command stops the PHP code from processing immediately. Let's take a look at this in the browser. If I click on a valid shirt, the shirt ID in the web address is 101. The product ID variable also has a value of 101. The working product array has all the information corresponding to shirt 101. Let's take a look at what happens when the shirt ID in the web address is invalid. Now we see something different. The product ID still has a value, but the working product array now is null. If we remove the shirt ID from the web address altogether, we'll see something even different. The product ID is now also null. We need to write code in this file that handles both these situations. First, let's write a conditional using PHP's isSet function to make sure that the get variable named ID exists. We'll put these two lines here inside the conditional, so we'll only assign a value to product ID and product when we have the get variable. We also need to check that the ID we have represents a valid shirt. After we put the shirt ID into the product ID variable, let's next check that the products array has an element with that shirt ID in it. That's how we'll know if the shirt ID in the web address is valid, if there's an element in the products array with that key. Let me add some else blocks and some testing code just to show you how it's working. If we have a shirt ID, then we'll execute the code here. If we don't have a shirt ID, we can check that in an else block. If we have a shirt ID, we'll check if it's valid here. If it is valid, this block will execute. If it's not valid though, an else block here would execute. I'll remove this testing code from earlier, and let's take a look at all three of these scenarios in the browser. When the ID is 101, we have a valid shirt ID. When it's 4, we have a shirt ID, but it's invalid. When I remove it, we have no shirt ID. The only time the working product array gets set is if we have a valid shirt ID. Otherwise, it won't be set. We can use that fact to determine whether or not we have a valid product or not. Let's remove all this testing code and then write a conditional that checks if the product array exists. This conditional now checks if we have a valid shirt. We could move all our code up here, but the file could get a bit difficult to maintain with so much of it nested inside a conditional. Let's instead write our conditional to check if the product array does not exist. The negation operator in PHP is an exclamation point. There are a few different ways it might be used in a conditional. Let's take a look at a simple conditional that checks if a variable has a value. You can have this check that the variable does not have the value by changing the first equal sign to an exclamation point. The code inside this conditional will now only execute if the variable has a value other than the one being checked. With the isSet function, we can negate it by putting the negation operator in front of the function name, like this. This conditional now checks if the product variable is not set. If it's not set, then the code in this block will execute. If it does not exist, let's redirect to the shirts listing page. If the product array is not set, we redirect to the shirts listing page. If it is set, we skip this block of code and render the page as normal. Let's go back to the browser. If we have a valid shirt ID, we see the page correctly. If we have an invalid shirt ID, we get redirected to the shirts listing page. The same thing happens if we have no shirt ID.